There's a strange kind of comfort in feeling like you're getting closer, without actually moving. You open another video, another tab, another explanation of the thing you already understand, at least in your head, and for a moment it feels good, like something is clicking, like you're almost there. But then the day ends the same way it always does. Nothing has really changed. Not in your hands, not in your habits, not in your life. It's subtle, which is why it's easy to miss. You don't feel lazy. You don't feel stuck. If anything, you feel engaged, curious, even disciplined, because you're showing up, you're learning, you're trying to get it right. But there's this quiet gap that keeps widening between what you know and what you can actually do. And most people never question that gap. They just keep feeding it. More information, more clarity, more one last thing before they begin. It starts to feel responsible, even smart, like you're preparing properly. But if you sit with it long enough, something feels off. Because preparation isn't supposed to last forever. At some point it was supposed to turn into something real, something visible, something a little uncomfortable. Instead, it stays clean, untouched, still sitting safely in your mind where nothing can go wrong. There's a version of you that already knows this. You felt it before. That small moment when you realize you've been circling the same idea again and again, without ever stepping into it. Not because you don't care, not because you're incapable, but because stepping into it would change everything. It would expose where you're actually at. It would replace the idea of progress with something far less controlled, something slower, messier, real. And that's where things start to shift. Because once you see it, you can't really unsee it. You start noticing how easy it is to stay in that space, where everything makes sense, but nothing is tested, where you can imagine yourself getting better, without ever risking being bad. And the longer you stay there, the more convincing it becomes, like you're doing the work, when you're only rehearsing it in your mind. That's the part no one really talks about. Not the obvious distractions, but this one, the one that looks like progress, feels like progress, even sounds like progress when you explain it to someone else, but quietly keeps you in the same place. And if you've been there for a while, you start to build something else on top of it. Confidence without proof. Clarity without friction. A kind of certainty that hasn't been tested yet. It feels solid until the moment you actually try to use it. That's when it slips. And for a lot of people, that moment never comes. Not because they can't reach it, but because they never leave this phase. They stay preparing, refining, understanding, waiting for the point where it all feels complete enough to begin. But that point doesn't arrive. Not like that. If anything, the longer you wait, the harder it becomes to step out of it. Because now there's more to protect, more knowledge, more identity, more pressure to not look like a beginner anymore. So you keep going back to what feels familiar, learning, consuming, stacking more on top of something that was never meant to stay still. And maybe that's why you're here, not just to hear something new, but to finally see something clearly enough that it changes how you move after this. That's what this space is for. Not just ideas you can agree with, but ones that follow you when the video ends. On this channel, Soul Fuel, that's the direction everything points toward. Not more to hold on to, but something you can actually step into. Because understanding something deeply shouldn't leave you in the same place. It should pull you forward. Even if it's uncomfortable, even if it's messy, even if it starts with something small. And if you've been feeling that gap between knowing and doing, then you already know where this is going. We're not staying in that space anymore. There's a point where learning stops being helpful and starts becoming something else. It doesn't happen loudly. No clear moment where you decide, I'm avoiding the work now. It just shifts. You sit down to understand something. Maybe it's a skill, a business idea, a creative path you've been thinking about for a while. At first, it's genuine. You're curious. You're trying to figure things out. So you watch one video, then another. You take notes. You start connecting ideas. And it feels good. Not in a shallow way, but in a way that feels earned. Like you're building something real. But then it keeps going. You don't just understand the basics anymore. You start going deeper. Advanced strategies, different perspectives, mistakes to avoid. You start to recognize patterns. You can almost predict what the next video will say before it says it. And somewhere in that process, something changes. You're no longer learning because you need to start. You're learning so you don't have to. There's someone, call him Daniel. He's been thinking about starting a small online business for almost a year now. Nothing unrealistic, just something simple. Selling a product, building a brand, figuring it out as he goes. At the beginning, he had no idea what he was doing. So he did what most people do. He started learning, watched videos on marketing, read about product research, studied what other people were doing. And honestly, it helped. He started to understand things he didn't before. How attention works, why some things sell and others don't. He felt like he was getting closer. But here's the part that's easy to miss. He never actually started. Not once. Every time he got close, there was always something else. Another strategy he hadn't explored yet. Another mistake he wanted to avoid. Another video that promised a better way to do it. So he kept going. Weeks turned into months. And if you asked him, he wouldn't say he was stuck. He'd say he was preparing. That's what makes this trap so effective. It doesn't feel like avoidance. It feels responsible. It feels like you're doing things the right way, taking your time, making sure you don't mess it up. But underneath that, something else is happening. You're getting used to the feeling of progress without ever facing the reality of it. Because real progress doesn't feel like that. It's slower, less clear. Sometimes it even feels like you're going backwards. There's confusion, mistakes, moments where you realize you don't actually know what you thought you knew. And that experience, that friction, is exactly what this phase protects you from. Daniel didn't avoid starting because he was lazy. If anything, he was more disciplined than most people. He showed up every day. He learned. He paid attention. But he stayed in a version of the process where nothing could challenge him, where everything stayed in his head, clean, organized, and under control. And the longer he stayed there, the harder it became to leave. Because now starting wouldn't just mean trying. It would mean risking being wrong about everything he thought he understood. That's the quiet trade you make without realizing it. You exchange the discomfort of being a beginner for the comfort of feeling informed. And over time, that comfort becomes harder to let go of. Not because it's better, but because it's safer. And once you see it like that, it changes how all of this looks. Because now it's not just about learning anymore. It's about what you're using learning for. If you stay with that pattern long enough, you start to notice something. It's not just habit. It's not just discipline either. There's a kind of pull to it. You sit down to learn for a bit, and it almost takes over from there. One video becomes 3, 3 turns into an hour. And when you're done, you don't feel drained. You feel satisfied. Not fully, but enough to feel like the day wasn't wasted. That feeling matters more than it seems. Because your mind doesn't really separate real progress from the feeling of progress. It responds to both in a similar way. You understand something new, you connect a few ideas, something clicks into place, and you get rewarded for it. A small sense of relief, a bit of excitement. That quiet thought, okay, now I get it. And without realizing it, you start chasing that feeling. Go back to Daniel for a second. There were moments where he almost started. He had ideas written down, even a name for the brand. One evening, he opened his laptop, ready to actually put something together. But before he did, he paused. Just for a minute. He thought, let me quickly check one thing. Something small. Something harmless. He wanted to make sure he wasn't missing anything. So he searched for one more video, just to confirm. That video led to another, then another. Different opinions, better strategies, things he hadn't considered yet. By the time he stopped, his original plan didn't feel solid anymore. It felt incomplete. So he closed his laptop, not because he gave up, but because now it made more sense to wait, to refine it a bit more, to get it right. That's how it happens. Not through distraction, but through something that feels useful. Every time you learn a little more, your standards shift. What felt good enough to start yesterday suddenly feels rushed today. So the starting point keeps moving, further away, just out of reach. And because learning gives you that sense of movement, you don't question it. You don't feel stuck. You feel like you're getting closer. But there's a problem with that. The kind of clarity you get from learning isn't the same clarity you get from doing. One is controlled, predictable. The other isn't. When you actually begin, things don't follow the structure you imagined. You run into things you didn't prepare for. Simple steps feel harder than expected. And that gap between what you thought you knew and what you can actually handle becomes visible. So your mind does something very simple. It guides you back to where things feel clear again. Back to learning. Back to understanding. Back to that familiar feeling of being on track without having to prove it. And the longer this loop runs, the more natural it starts to feel. You stop seeing it as a phase. It just becomes how you operate, learn, refine, delay, again and again, until the idea of starting feels heavier than it should. By the time this pattern has been running for months, sometimes years, it starts to feel solid. You convince yourself that you're prepared, that you understand enough, that you could start at any moment. And in some ways, that's true. You could start, but you haven't. And that's where it becomes dangerous. Because the longer you wait, the more convincing this sense of readiness feels. You build confidence without testing it, a kind of invisible armor that protects you from failure and from action. It shows up in small ways. You read something, and your mind whispers, I could do this, if I wanted to. You write down ideas, and it feels productive. You sketch plans that look neat on paper, and yet nothing leaves your notebook. That confidence, that feeling of control, is real enough to soothe you, but not strong enough to move you forward. Think about someone like James Clear. Before he wrote Atomic Habits, he had countless blog posts that barely anyone read. He wasn't ready. He didn't feel ready. He was just doing the work anyway. Every post felt small, imperfect, exposed, and yet each one chipped away at the invisible fear of starting. Sarah Blakely didn't have a business background. She had ideas that seemed too big, too risky. But she started anyway, fumbling, testing, failing in ways no one saw at first. Even Steve Jobs, a name we associate with genius, built products, made mistakes, got things wrong publicly before anyone would call him a master. The lesson is the same. Action comes before mastery. Here's what it looks like for someone in that loop. You sit, planning, learning, preparing. You imagine yourself taking the leap. You imagine the work going perfectly. And you imagine yourself succeeding. That imagined success gives you a hit of satisfaction. It convinces you, I'm ready. But when the first attempt comes, reality tests everything you thought you knew. It's awkward, it's messy, it's uncomfortable, and for a lot of people, that first attempt never comes until something nudges them or forces them out of that loop. The dangerous part: the longer you wait in this invisible preparation, the heavier it feels to finally act. Your brain has built a version of you that's confident without proof. You feel ready. You feel capable. You feel like you could do it. And the truth is, you could. But the weight of the untested confidence makes you hesitate. You see your ideas in your head, polished, complete, finished, and the real, messy version. It feels too small, too exposed, too incomplete. And that's exactly what keeps people circling, forever preparing, without moving. The moment you step out of preparation, the world doesn't hand you clarity. It hands you friction. That friction is where growth lives. Take James Clear, for example. He didn't wait to feel ready before publishing his first blog post. He wrote imperfectly, clumsy sentences and all, and pressed publish anyway. Every post felt small, awkward, even pointless at times, but each one carried him forward, little by little. Sarah Blakely didn't have a blueprint for launching Spanx. She cut fabric, tested ideas on herself, failed in ways that could have embarrassed her in public. She learned more from the mistakes she actually made than she ever could have from another article or course. Steve Jobs built devices that didn't work perfectly the first time. The Apple one was far from polished. The mistakes were visible. And yet each iteration taught him what no preparation could. Here's the pattern. Step 1. Do the thing you think you're not ready for. Step 2. Accept that the first attempt will feel messy. Step 3. Learn by doing, not by thinking. It's simple in words, but it's anything but easy. Our minds want polish before effort, neatness before experience. But the world rewards those who start anyway. You can think about it like planting a seed, reading about soil, sunlight, water, endlessly. But until the seed hits the dirt, nothing grows. That's what these people did. They planted the seed with messy hands, figuring it out as they went. And over time, growth followed. So what changes when you actually take that step? First, you stop feeding the loop of learning without doing. You feel the friction, yes, but that friction builds competence in a way research never can. Second, each small attempt reshapes your confidence. It becomes proven, not imagined. And third, it reveals the parts of your idea you didn't understand, which is exactly what you need to grow. That's the key. Your first action is never perfect. It's not supposed to be. It's a test, not a showcase. And that's why looking at these stories matters. Because each of them started before mastery existed, before clarity existed, before anyone could tell them they were ready. They started with uncertainty, with discomfort, with the simple act of doing. That's what begins the transformation. Starting doesn't mean doing everything at once. It means doing something small enough that it's possible, but big enough that it matters. Look at Mr. Beast. Before he became a YouTube giant, he made hundreds of videos that barely anyone watched. They were awkward. The editing was rough. The ideas weren't polished. And yet each one taught him something. About timing. About storytelling. About what people actually cared about. He didn't wait until he knew enough to make a hit video. He started with what he had, and he adjusted as he went. The first step you take should feel uncomfortable, but manageable. Not so big that it crushes you. Not so small that it doesn't teach you anything. If you're building a skill, make your first attempt public in some way, even just to yourself. A draft, a sketch, a recording. If you're launching a project, start with a test, a small version of the thing you imagine. The point isn't to be perfect. The point is to feel the friction, to see what works, to see what doesn't. Every small attempt becomes a feedback loop. You try something. It fails. You adjust. You try again. Over time, those small adjustments accumulate into something far bigger than any preparation alone could create. Sarah Blakely cut and tested Spanx herself. She didn't have a factory or a marketing team at first. She learned what worked by doing it, by failing, by fixing. Steve Jobs didn't get Apple right the first time. He iterated, learned from mistakes, and rebuilt. This is how action replaces theory. Small, imperfect steps, visible results. Learning from doing, not thinking. And here's the subtle shift most people miss. Once you start, the friction that once felt scary becomes fuel. You begin to move faster. You begin to see what you didn't notice before. You begin to trust yourself more. Not your plans, not your knowledge, but your ability to figure things out along the way. Taking the first step is only the beginning. The real challenge is keeping going. It's easy to start once, feel the friction, then step back into the comfort of learning again. That's why momentum matters. Because action isn't just a single push. It's a series of small, deliberate moves that build on each other. Think about James Clear again. Every blog post he published didn't just teach him about writing. It taught him about consistency, about feedback, about his audience. One post led to another, and the lessons compounded. Momentum grew quietly, almost invisibly, until it became unstoppable. Sarah Blakely didn't launch Spanx perfectly. She tested, failed, refined, one small iteration after another. Each mistake was a signal. Each small success was fuel. Steve Jobs didn't have the perfect product at first. He iterated relentlessly. Each version taught him what worked and what didn't. Every small improvement compounded into the vision we know today. Momentum comes from trusting the process of doing, not from perfect planning, not from endless learning, from actually acting. Every small attempt teaches you something you can't get anywhere else. And when you string those small attempts together, they start to move you forward faster than theory ever could. Even when it feels messy, even when it feels like you're failing, even when progress seems invisible. That's the quiet, compounding effect. It doesn't look dramatic at first, but over time, it builds something real. The key is to keep linking each step to the one before it. Don't treat attempts as isolated. Treat them as experiments that feed into each other. Every adjustment, every small victory, every visible failure, it all adds up. Your skill grows. Your confidence grows. Your understanding grows. And slowly, what once felt impossible begins to feel inevitable. Even as you start moving, something unexpected happens. The first step feels scary. The next few steps feel doable. Then, right when momentum begins to build, resistance shows up. It doesn't arrive as a shout. It's quiet, subtle, A small voice in your head. Are you sure this will work? Maybe you need more time. What if you fail? It's normal. It's human. And it's not a signal to stop. Look at Mr. Beast again. Even after hundreds of videos, after seeing small results, he still faced uncertainty every time he tried something new. Every idea felt risky. Every experiment could flop. But he leaned into the fear. He moved anyway. Sarah Blakely faced rejection constantly at the beginning. Stores didn't want to carry her product. People laughed at her ideas. And yet she kept going, adjusting, refining, acting. Steve Jobs dealt with criticism and setbacks repeatedly. Every launch, every product was a test of patience, skill, and nerve. And he didn't retreat from the discomfort. He worked through it. Resistance is inevitable because growth is uncomfortable. The more you stretch yourself, the more your mind reminds you of the risks, the mistakes, the unknown. That's not failure. That's a signal that you're on the right path. The trick is to notice it without surrendering to it. You don't argue with it. You don't fight it endlessly. You simply acknowledge, this is part of the process. Then you act anyway. Small, deliberate actions are the antidote. Even when fear or doubt arises, taking just one concrete step keeps momentum alive. It reminds you that progress is not about being fearless. It's about moving forward despite fear. And here's something most people miss. The mind often exaggerates the difficulty of the next step. When you finally act, reality usually feels easier than imagined. Mistakes happen, but they aren't as devastating as fear suggested. You learn. You adjust. You keep going. Momentum, once established, becomes a protective force against hesitation. Each step makes the next step easier. Each small success reduces resistance, not by eliminating it, but by proving you can move through it. Taking action once is important. Taking it consistently is transformative. It's not enough to plant a seed. You have to water it day after day, even when it's messy, even when progress feels slow. Think of James Clear again. Writing one blog post wasn't enough. He showed up repeatedly, refining his ideas, learning from what didn't work, and building small successes into something bigger. That repetition, over months and years, created the momentum that carried him forward. Sarah Blakely didn't launch Spanx perfectly in a single moment. She tested, she adjusted, she kept going, learning from every small attempt. Her persistence turned the messy beginnings into a thriving business. Even Mr. Beast didn't reach millions of subscribers overnight. Hundreds of videos, countless mistakes, and endless adjustments created habits that compounded into results. The key is consistency in imperfection. You don't wait for clarity. You don't wait for perfect conditions. You act. You review. You adjust. You act again. Every small attempt, repeated over time, becomes a habit. The friction that once felt uncomfortable becomes the rhythm of your progress. The mind still resists, but the habit provides a structure to move forward despite that resistance. Start small. Keep the steps manageable. Focus on progress, not polish. Let feedback and experience guide you. Eventually, action becomes easier than overthinking. Momentum takes over. The messy beginnings transform into visible skill, visible results, and visible growth. And then, what once felt impossible, starting, showing up, taking risks, becomes natural. It becomes part of who you are. Look back for a moment at the journey we've explored. You start with knowledge, with understanding, with preparation. It feels good. It feels safe. You imagine progress, polish, mastery, all without leaving your comfort zone. But that safety comes at a cost. Time passes. Confidence grows. Untested. Ideas remain ideas. Skills remain latent. Then comes the first step. It's messy. It's uncomfortable. The friction is real. And for the first time, the gap between knowing and doing starts to close. From that step comes momentum. Small actions, repeated, adjusted, refined, iterated. The friction doesn't disappear, but it begins to fuel growth instead of fear. And as momentum builds, resistance appears. Fear, doubt, hesitation. But it's no longer a stopping force. It's a signal, a reminder that growth is happening. Then habits form. Not habits of perfection, but habits of doing. Imperfect, deliberate, consistent doing. James Clear, Sarah Blakely, Steve Jobs, Mr. Beast, all of them followed this arc. They started with uncertainty. They leaned into discomfort. They acted before mastery existed. They iterated, adjusted, and kept going. And over time, the messy, imperfect actions became real results. Momentum compounded. Confidence became proven. Ideas transformed into skills. Dreams transformed into achievements. The mental model is simple, but it works. 1. Start small. Start messy. 2. Take deliberate, visible steps. 3. Use friction as fuel. 4. Keep momentum alive through repetition. 5. Form habits of action, not preparation. If you hold this in mind, preparation becomes a tool, not a trap. Knowledge becomes a bridge, not a cage. And progress, real, tangible progress, becomes inevitable. So take that first imperfect step. Do something small today. Let it be messy. Let it be uncomfortable. The next step will follow. And then the next. Because growth doesn't come from waiting. It comes from moving. If you've stayed with this video, Soul Fuel is here to help you keep taking those steps. Every idea, every story, every reflection is designed to give you the push to move from thinking to doing, so you can turn your preparation into real momentum and your ideas into results.